So what we're going to give you today is just a very basic case. This is an important round. It's going to be a clean round. We're not going to get any silliness. It's going to be less than novel, but it should be for like a good debate. You are the spirit of the United States, which is to say the U.S. government, irrespective of temporal concerns, right? So it should be pretty simple in that respect. Just don't argue anything about administrative potential or the idea of whether or not this bill, as bill, would ever get passed. And we're going to basically talk about hate crimes, good or bad, on balance, within the spirit of the United States, or kind of a general administrative idea. And any questions, and I'll stop. Did you have questions?
Sorry.
You should, and it's op choice, yeah. So.
Oh, it's op choice. Op choice.
It is, in fact, yeah.
So, are hate crimes a crime? Yes or no? Is that what we're choosing?
Well, that would be sort of tautological. Basically, should hate crimes exist as an idea? Right?
As an idea, okay.
Yes,
something
hate crime legislation, good or bad?
Okay.
So something that punishes the thing we now call hate crime, good or bad?
In fact, yeah. Sorry about that. I figured it was too stock.
All right, we'll keep it.
You will keep hate crimes for the status quo. Uncreative to the extreme. All right. So, which case is which? Get rid of that. Great, guys. So, the first idea as to why hate crime legislation is pretty problematic is the idea of the vague standard, right? What I'm not going to get up here and tell you at first is that any vague standard is necessarily always bad, right? Sometimes a complicated idea isn't necessarily a bad idea, and the legislative system is designed to uncover things that are complicated. I'm just going to start off with that because I don't want to get into any messiness about that. But the idea as to whether or not this complication can ever properly be called a principle or a standard is really what this first point's meant to address. And I think the idea here is that the difficulty in assessing a trial at all on the basis of a hate crime is so problematic based on the idea of the standard, which can't, I think, because of what I'm about to tell you, ever be properly called a standard, that it shouldn't, in fact, be that, or in this case, a law. So, just a quick example, right? In a bar fight, a guy might, be very angry at another person, might throw a punch, whatever, knock the guy out. The question is, maybe he's even really angry, but does he hate the person, or is there even hate involved in the crime? The question then becomes, if there even is hate in the crime, what does the person hate? Does he hate kind of a group in the abstract? Does he hate this particular person? And does particularistic hate merit the same idea of hate? If you hate someone personally, is that also hate? The question then becomes whether or not this is simply a tax on the idea of minority disposition, or the idea of attacking a minority, or is it something altogether different? These are very strange ideas. The government has no consensus. I would hope some sort of burden to this effect should rest on this side of the House, some sort of declarative burden here. But there are two impacts to the idea of this problem, right? Two real reasons to believe that the problem here isn't just a problem for the sake of solving a debate round, but rather really cast doubt upon whether or not this can actually properly be called a principle, or a good one at that. The first is the idea of why it slows the communication of justice, which is knowable, right? The knowable component of the justice in this question, the idea that someone was actually hit in a bar, or the idea that someone was actually murdered, those knowable components don't enter into the system at the point at which there's an added component which delays the entire idea. It's kind of like a package deal, right? You don't get one unless you get the other. And at the point at which one is so unresolvable in the first place, it's very difficult to get the justice in the first place, which if in any sense is denied, we say is always going to be delayed in that same regard. But the second main impact here is the idea of why this necessarily leads to a really problematic situation where individuals have to be condemned by their past, right? At the point at which all of a sudden the idea of a person that is in the abstract, whether or not you can actually qualitatively decide who this person is who committed an act, becomes part of the courtroom, what happens is an investigative trial tends to go back and look at repeated concerns in the past to see about a trajectory of hate. This idea is the only possible way of establishing the idea of hate, short of absolute psychoanalysis permitted only to God. No thanks. So since we don't have God over here, all we have is the past. But we would call in this case the past ex post facto, or the haunting of the idea of not even a double jeopardy or triple jeopardy, but the casted shadow of simple experience on a crime that was never actually committed. We say in this case, it's really problematic to punish people for things which weren't properly bad things in the first place, which weren't illegal, but only the trajectory of belief. That's going to become more problematic as we get to the philosophy later on, but for now, let's simply say that the standard is so problematic right up front that you have a lot to listen for in the next speech. The second argument then has to be the idea of the principle, right? And the principle is like really, really problematic. The first idea as to why these things exist in the first place, the entire idea as to why we necessarily even like want to have hate crimes, right, is because we want to kind of like deter some sort of bad thing in the first place, right? We're okay with legislation which tries to put a premium on the idea of deterrence. That's totally cool. But at the point at which you actually add a component to something which is only penalizing something which no one in the United States would ever penalize, that is to say, free speech, we think something's really problematic. So here's the basic analysis. Here's the basic calculus. The same crime is committed in two different places at the same, wherever, whatever, in theory. But the only difference between the crimes is what this person believes when he commits the crime. We would say at that point, the only reason this crime is any different is the idea that you've actually added a benefit or detriment to the idea of the crime on the basis of belief held by the committer. We say at that point, this crime, that is to say, this punishment, becomes only a tax on belief, only a punishment for ideology. We say this doesn't make sense given the spirit of the United States, given any U.S. government administration that should ever appropriate anything like this, and I'll take your right on that.
Sure, but let's suppose that we absolutely know someone had hate in their heart when they committed a crime. Isn't there a more larger marginal social harm to the community done as well?
First of all, although I love philosophy, I would beg to differ that you can ever win around simply by saying, what if we absolutely knew anything? Because given the very first point, which I spent exhaustively talking about why you will never absolutely know this, short of doing something which I would say is already unjust, which is to say punishing someone for who they've been ideologically, I would disagree with the argument altogether. But second of all, what I would say is that absolute knowledge of hate in the first place doesn't necessarily equate to anything knowable as, in terms of hate, insofar as hate itself doesn't actually get definition on the side of the house. What hate actually becomes then is an idea of a way to get rid of politics, is a way to get rid of the idea of the ideology in the first place. It doesn't become an actual implementation of something that you can actually adjudicate on the basis of objective standards, only the idea of something that the government wants to impose because of its own beliefs, right? That we're going to talk about in just a second is going to become really problematic for precedent and the idea of what this could evolve into as far as a legal system, what most legislators are afraid of right now. So then we go down and we talk about this second idea, right? Not that this is just an arbitrary penalty on freedom of speech, but that this is really important. There are laws already on the books about stuff like this, right? Laws are already in the books that say don't murder, don't punch someone, don't do all of the bad things that might be done in hate crimes short of the actual ideological component. The only difference is the idea, the patterned notion. And here are some reasons why this doesn't make sense. First, like design, or the fact that like someone did something with intention based on like an overarching design or aesthetic idea has never been part of like why we add punishment. For instance, serial killers don't have a rule that says they must be punished more difficultly just because they happen to kill people according to a design. Or similarly, because petty crime repeats over and over and over doesn't mean we cut someone's hand off to get rid of it. So the idea of something being pressing by repetition or pressing by design doesn't make any sense. And third, however, we would say that ultimately another bad reason why this necessarily looks bad in terms of principle is because the only way to actually conclusively prove any of this stuff is by relying on self-testimony, which is to say an interested party, the victim, relying on that self-testimony to prove the idea of the hate in the first place. We say it's already biased against the perpetrator, and we say that's problematic because that already goes against the idea of innocent until proven guilty and the notions that we like to ascribe to those, even despite the idea of the politics that on this side of the House is presumed against the offending party. But the final argument, this idea, is how this like sets a precedent for punishing individuals who hold unpopular beliefs, right? I mean, like these precedents can later be used, I think, very conclusively to turn against the very minority interest that in the first place they're meant to protect right now. I mean, the idea that like it's difficult to reinterpret, for instance, a murder law, generally speaking, but it's very easy to reinterpret the motives for the murder law later down the road when the same law is still on the books in the government. We say that's super problematic, and we don't like to put laws on the books that have the potential for abuse later down the road, even if right now they've been put to good use. For all of these reasons, we're proud to propose. Thanks a lot.
I thank the Prime Minister for his remarks. Now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to review the case in a speech not exceeding 8 minutes. Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Thanks for calling me up to the floor, Mr. Speaker. Thanks, true friends on SideGov. Enjoy an interesting case. I think it's going to be a good round. Thanks, Andrew, for debating with me throughout, like the entire year. That being said, I think that what we want to do today is give you 2 independent points of case and then go go into a lot of the meat that we hear from the government. So the first thing that Andrew and I want to tell you about is the fact that we really feel that there is a large additional harm that comes from hate crimes. Now, what exactly are these harms? Like, recognize, Mr. Speaker, we understand that, like, as they talk about in their second point, that there are, like, in these situations, sure, we have laws on the books that say murder is illegal, that doing other things like that is illegal. But the reason why we think that hate crimes exist and why we think they should continue to exist is that we feel that there is this large additional harm. But the question is, what is that harm? We say that in situations, for instance, where there is a group of people in society, a group which has either historically had some sort of wrong done against them, or a group that is particularly, like, subjected to potential abuse. We think that when they live in an environment where people are able to take advantage of that, whether it be playing on past problems, like, for instance, like racial tension, or whether it be some other minority group, like perhaps like like Jewish Americans or Jewish people in some other country. Actually, no, sorry, it's in the U.S. So Jewish Americans, my mistake. But we think that in a situation like that, we think that it's particularly bad to, like, allow for people to have, like, creeping, like, levels of racism. And we think that, like, particularly having a hate crime, like, legislation, some sort of law in the book, allows for people, no thank you, to, like, recognize that there is some sort of, like, additional protection. Now, what we think does happen is that, like, ultimately, there's, like, a level of societal discourse that doesn't occur without hate crime laws, right? We think that one of the benefits from having these is that people, like, talk about what is acceptable to do to, like, certain community, people, like, different members of different communities. And we understand, like, what the boundary is, right? Because under their side of the house, like, recognize that, like, ultimately you have people going back and forth, but there's not really any discourse about it because there's not any sort of, like, community standard, right? Recognize that it's sort of ambiguous. Wow, I really can't talk about where that standard's going to be. But the second thing we want to talk about is, like, the standard that, like, the standard that we hold. And we say what we say is that, like, at the point that there's, like, damage done to the community, and we think that it's, like, relatively easy in most situations to actually make this. Now, I know that they do a lot of work preempting and telling you why the standard is bad and why the standard is not something that we can, like, easily understand. But, like, okay, so in a situation, like, you look at the crime, and we think that most of these are going to be reasonably easy to understand. So say that, like, one of us, like, say Andrew goes and kills someone, right? So sure, if he just kills someone, yes, that's murder. But at the point that he kills someone, and there are witnesses, like, that saw him saying, you know, like, I hate Jews or something like that, and doing, like, lots of pernicious things like that, or perhaps they, like, leave a sign with spray paint or something with a swastika. We think it's pretty clear in most situations that an additional crime has been done, right? Because not only did they kill someone, but they left a very offensive message to a particular group with a very targeted meaning. Sure.
I think you could just as easily say that anyone could go down to any community and without the murder component rise the same amount of riots just by saying the same things. The idea, though, is that they would never be taken to jail or never be put in prison just because they said the things. The idea then is that you can't distinguish, and you've never given a good reason why, in this case, you're particularly valuing the idea of justice.
Okay, so if I understand the question, what they're concerned that people who don't commit other particularly large crimes like a murder aren't going to be held accountable. But the reason why we're okay drawing the line in a situation like this is it's clear that the motivation of the larger crime was also linked through like a hate crime violation. And we're okay with doing that simply because we think that there's like an additional harm done with that. It it's like a secondary part of the crime. Now recognize, Mr. Speaker, that we think in a situation where like perhaps someone goes down and says bad things in an environment and doesn't kill someone, we think that that like ultimately has a different level. Because we think that in a situation like that, there's like an opportunity for discourse, right? At the point that someone, like there's some sort of large crime committed, there's no opportunity for that to be interacted with in that sphere. And we think that like ultimately we're okay with defending like the ability for discourse to occur. We think at the point that like a pernicious crime is committed in the name of hate, we think that that crosses the line. And I'm going to talk more about that standard in depth when I go line by line on their case. So that being said, I want to get started on this, on like all their argumentation about like why the standard is vague. So first they say that it's hard to say what exactly hate is, and it's always a question of like what the individual's intent was. But like we tell you off case, we think we have a pretty clear standard. It's hate towards a specific group. Now we would say that like if there's just hate done towards a particular individual, like if Andrew, instead of saying that like he hates Jews when killing someone, like if Andrew kills me and he says I hate you, Rich, like recognize that that's not a hate crime against me because like he killed me for some reason. But it's not like targeting me for some like other characteristic which I can't control about myself. We think that at the point that you like target someone for race or target someone for a characteristic that they don't control, we think that that's different. But then they tell us that but ultimately we put them in people in a bad situation because we look at their past and we hold them accountable for what's occurred already. But recognize we think that we can determine individual things pretty often, and in most situations it's pretty clear when someone does something and it's clear that they make some sort of racial threat or leave some sort of sign at the time. We think that it's a pretty small concern, and we think that sure there might be a few cases in which it's not 100% clear, but we say that's what we have the legal system for in the United States and in other countries as well, to make decisions on things that are ambiguous and make close calls, right? They do it all the time. We don't see any particular risk why this is any different. Last one.
Right, the legal system is internalized in this round. You can't simply fall back on the idea that somehow the legal system will work everything out and you have no burden at all to prove the idea that the standard isn't vague. You can't just hope that the legal system will be idyllic and always do this. Give me some reason to believe it's not vague.
Okay, so the argument I'm making is that, I'm arguing, we think in most cases there's enough clarity out there to make the call because there's evidence. We're willing to grant you that it's not going to be 100% perfect, right? No law is 100% perfect. But we think that the legal system, the way it's designed, is pretty good in this situation. Sure, it's not going to solve 100%, but we think it more than outweighs any sort of harm we get from these few bad cases by getting to prosecute all the other hate crimes. But then they talk about the idea that ultimately we risk putting people in for double jeopardy. But I think that there's we need to draw this idea out a little bit more, because what they're saying is that we're punishing someone in addition for I guess the best way to say it is that recognize that for something that they've done in the past, right? And assume that they've had some sort of tendency towards hate crime. But we think that it's actually different, because we think that the crime that was done in the past is a unique and separate crime, right? If they've acted hateful towards people in the past, it's not like you're trying them for that again. It just shows that they may have a tendency for that. It doesn't mean that they didn't commit it this time around, right? We just think that would potentially show a pattern of behavior, and we don't think that this is any. There's no principal distinction between this and for instance if someone goes in for spousal abuse, right? We're not trying them again for having done abuse in the past, but we see that there's a tendency, right? And we accept it in areas like that, and we don't think that there's really a distinction in something moving into hate crimes. But then they talk about the idea of that ultimately we really like free speech, and this is only going to be a punishment for someone's ideology potentially. But sure, we agree that people are allowed to have expression, right? But it's to a point. There's a reason why your First Amendment rights to speech have certain limitations. And what are those limitations? Recognize, Mr. Speaker, at the point at which it impinges on either it prevents someone else from having their right to engage in speech acts, or it in some way harms them in a way which the community deems to be inappropriate. We would say in this situation that at the point that the community clearly understands that these groups that are protected by hate crime legislation have a certain reason that they do need to be protected, we think it's pretty clear that ultimately this is going to be a good thing. So they make two more arguments. First, they say that there are laws on the books to say that these things are bad already. But I've already talked about this off case, right? We think that there is a unique and separate harm from these things occurring, and I'm not going to give any more analysis here. But the last point is this idea that we think that we set a precedent for punishing minority views, and we say, okay, sure. So this is not really any different than any other potential area of the legal system out there, right? Anytime there's a standard set, it's done by the majority, and we think that there's always a risk of punishing a minority view. But we don't use this as an excuse to not legislate in other areas, right, Mr. Speaker? They don't do any analysis to show you why this is a particular situation in which we need to be any more cautious than we do in other areas. We think for many reasons, Mr. Speaker, we're very proud to support the rights of minority groups. We're proud to protect people from hate crimes, and ultimately we think we give you a better world, a world in which we can solve most of the cases. We're more than happy to accept the harm of maybe missing a few that aren't absolutely clear. We're very proud to oppose.
Here, here. I thank the Leader of Opposition and now call upon the Member of Government to reaffirm the case of speech not exceeding 8 minutes. Here, here.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Recognise they hung their entire substantive case today on two nebulous ideas. Firstly, social harms, which is defined by a standard of does it harm the community, which we say is not a standard at all. And secondly, the idea of does this create an opportunity for discourse, which we say indeed if it is their standard, then murder can sometimes create an opportunity for discourse. We don't think this is a great way to pursue this round. But let's address those both points. The first thing we heard was this idea of social harms. They said that we have oppressed groups, we have racial tensions. They said we need to stop creeping racism within a community. And what we tell you is that they're not banning racism on this side of the house. Nor are they banning racist views, nor are they banning racist allegiances, nor are they banning racist speech. Indeed, they're doing absolutely nothing to ban the racism they profess to hate so much. Wipe out the first minute of his speech where he talked lyrical about racists. We say what you're actually doing here is pursuing a law which is related directly, essentially, to a particular crime. And we say that insofar as they're pursuing this law for a message intent, they're pursuing essentially a law for a voice intent on the part of the government to say we disagree with racism. We say, first of all, it's fundamentally redundant insofar as the US government has already made very clear through their pronouncements that they disagree with racism. We say, furthermore, though, that we think it will actually have a counterproductive effect on laws in general, insofar as the government pursuing laws that are solely put in place for a message intent is generally a very, very bad idea, because people start to confuse laws that were actually put in place to be enforced and to mean something with those that you simply put there to express your opinion that you didn't have any other way to express. We say that's very problematic to be using laws in this manner. And we tell you furthermore, though, that it's been told you at the beginning of the speech, that even nasty people have rights, that even racist people have rights, and that we don't think that you have a right, essentially, to beat someone up. But we think that when you do beat someone up, you still do have some rights of due process, and they haven't given us any convincing reason of why those rights should be different simply because of what was going through your head at the time. The next thing, though, they told us was the standard of damage done to the community. And they said it's very easy to tell someone. They said, you killed someone and you left a message there. And what we told you first of all is, well, yes, in a few circumstances that may be the case, but that's not generally the way that we are judging hate crimes. That someone left a convenient message saying, oh, P.S. I'm a racist, and then left some kind of racial slur written beneath. We don't think that's normally the way that hate crimes are adjudicated. But we say that furthermore, as Ben told you in a point of information, that the murder is irrelevant to this, insofar as damage can be done to the community by racist comments made without a crime, and that they're doing nothing to ban this. This is fundamentally a problematic stance for them to take. If their standard is indeed damage to the community, they should have come out and countercased with an entire ban on racist speech within these areas. We say that a person can do a lot of damage by picking up a loudhailer in these communities and yelling out the racist slurs without killing anyone in the first instance. We think that it's fundamentally a comparable aspect. We don't see why the crime makes this different. What they then told us, though, is they said this idea of an opportunity for discourse. Essentially, that we want, what they said in response to Ben's point of information is that it's fundamentally different because there's an opportunity for discourse related to people speaking, unrelated to a murder. And what we say in response is essentially that we don't think, first of all, that these racist slogans do typically offer up an opportunity for discourse. In fact, as we're dealing with irrational emotive impulses by these actors that aren't essentially going to be discoursed and debated in a kind of nice cosmopolitan way. But we say, furthermore, if your standard is actually that it's different when there's a discourse, then that's not a standard which excludes all criminal acts. We say insofar as someone beating someone up and saying a racist slur at the same time gets that on the news in the evening and gets a whole heap of commentators saying things about the racism within this community, insofar as it gets people within the community firing back comments, we actually think you get more discourse related to a hate crime than simply hate speech. We think that insofar as that's the case, if discourse is their standard, then they're drawing an arbitrary distinction between hate speech, which they're not banning, and hate crimes, which they are. We say furthermore, though, under this idea of social harm, that we think that they fundamentally fail to take into account the fact that these are irrational views. That these are not people, essentially, who are simply going to be persuaded in this idea of a deterrent effect they have on these kind of views. We don't think that holds, because what we think you're seeing is not people who are highly rational and reasoning through these processes and seeing, oh, am I persuaded by the case against racism? We think these are people who are born with these impulses, or at least have developed them through specific acts. We think that, moreover, you're actually more likely to get a backlash within the community insofar as you see these groups seeing that the government is arbitrating their crimes by a different standard than other members of the same community. We say that's the sort of thing that actually hurts the perception within the community. If they're worried about discourse, we think that's what they should be considering. Let's then go case side. Because the first thing we talked about was this idea of a vague standard. We said that it's important that you can actually assess your trials based on an important standard. Ben pointed to the idea of a bar fight. He said when you're looking at who caused this, you have some fundamentally tricky questions to ask. And they introduced a new standard here as a response. They said, well, it's the standard of things that we can't control for ourselves. That when we have some kind of an attribute that we can't control for ourselves, then that's the sort of thing the government should seek to protect. And we say there are all sorts of things that are relevant in crimes unrelated to a hate aspect that you can't control for yourself. You often can't control for yourself being born into a slum and being very poor and having no way of getting out of the slum in which high crime rates persist. We say insofar as that's the case, that you are a victim of a crime because of something you couldn't control for yourself, but which was completely unrelated to the motives of the person pursuing that crime, we're not sure why you're excluding that. Yes, sir?
But the difference is you're not being seeked out for having done that. You might happen to be in that area, but the person doesn't perpetrate the crime against you because you are in the slum, right?
Okay, well, we tell you a few things, first of all, sir. We say, first of all, it's not always clear that hate crime someone is sought out. We say that it can essentially be the case of someone being the wrong race in the wrong place. We say, secondly, we don't think we've seen a justification from the side of the House of why the seeking aspect is important. Why it is that a crime becomes worse because someone was sought out, rather than that same crime having been perpetrated against someone simply because they happen to be in that neighbourhood. We don't see why the seeking aspect is important as a moral justification. No, thank you, sir. What we next heard, though, was this idea, when we told you about this thing, he said, well, the nature of the legal system is that they have to make tough choices. He said, they have to arbitrate. That's what a legal system is there for. And what Ben told you in Point of Information, he said, that's what this round's about arbitrating. We can't just simply say, well, there are politicians who can do this. There are lawyers who can do this. We can arbitrate away the tough distinctions. We need to be able to show that we have at least some kind of framework for judging these crimes, and particularly some sort of consistent framework for judging these crimes. Because what's important about the point that Ben made is not so much that courts will never be able to attempt this, but rather that courts will get perverse outcomes from these trials because they have no clear standards on which to judge this. And we think that insofar as you have inconsistent outcomes from the trials, that's the sort of thing that leads to a perversion within the justice system where you're not seeing consistent outcomes. The next thing we told you about, though, was this idea of this condemning people by their past. This is essentially that your past actions are primarily what you're going to be merited on in the case. Well, this in response is, well, this is just like spousal abuse, that there are essentially other crimes that we judge in the same way. We've got two responses. We say the first thing is, it's not the same as spousal abuse, because past instances of spousal abuse were also crimes. Past instances of saying racist things were not crimes and are still not crimes. It is very common in courtrooms to judge people based on the past crimes they have committed which are relevant to the direct crime they committed. We say there's not a problem in showing some kind of history of violence. There is a problem in showing a history of venting their speech, a right which we say they're not disputing today. But we tell you furthermore that it's a lot harder to identify the thoughts that went through someone's head or whether someone was serious when they were making a comment in their past than it is to identify whether they beat up their wife and whether that was reported at the time. We say insofar as spousal abuse involves a direct physical incident as opposed to a case of speech which essentially involves an extrapolation of what was intended by the person's comments at the time when they were not committing a crime, this is fundamentally more complex. Next told you about this idea of a principle. He said that the penalty needs to be linked to free speech, that this is a penalty fundamentally linked to free speech. And what they told you in response was, well, we have limits on free speech all the time, the kind of stop debater response. And what we tell you in response to that is essentially that, yes, we do have limits on free speech, insofar as we recognise their ability, essentially, to incite crimes within the community. We say that we don't essentially link that actual restriction on free speech to a crime that's already been committed. We say this is an unprecedented act. What we tell you furthermore in response to this idea of actually the nature of we can't know hate for certainty, we didn't really get a response to that. Finally, we told you this idea of the president, that essentially we do punish, this is essentially punishing unpopular views. They told you in response that, well, don't worry about that president because, we do the same sort of thing all the time. We say what we don't do all the time is particularise justice. Pull out one particular group and say that they're going to be arbitrated by a different justice system from others. We think that's fundamentally harmful. On these grounds, we're proud to oppose.
I thank the member of government and now call upon the member of opposition to construct a portion of the speech on
Thanks, Mr. Speaker, audience, of course, Rich for being a lovely partner, and you guys for proposing a very fair, open case. That said, all right, first I want to talk about our case and what we think the additional harm is, because I think they do a really good job strawmanning at this point, because they're like, oh, look, guys, you may want to stop racism, but that's not what's happening here. But Rich and I never told you that we're stopping racism entirely, right? We described to you the additional harm that happens when someone commits a hate crime, when someone commits an act of violence that is motivated not because of some economic motivation or personal vendetta, but rather against an entire group of people. We think there's an additional harm because you put that community in a state of fear, right? As soon as you accuse that, or as soon as you say that crime was committed because Jews are bad and you paint swastikas everywhere, what this is sending a very clear message to the community is we don't like you here, we don't accept you here. What this does to the Jewish population in this example is it creates in their mind a very real sense of fear. We distinguish this very clearly from just standard racist speech because it comes with an entirely credible threat, right? If I just say oh, I hate Jews, la-di-da, that might, the community can sort of wave that off, they can not like me as an individual, they can not want to be around me, but they don't genuinely fear me. They have no reason to genuinely fear for my safety. However, when I commit a crime, when I kill someone, when I beat someone because of that, then I genuinely instill fear. There's an additional harm done beyond traditional racist speech because of this credible threat. They don't tell you about this. They just say like, you're not stopping racism, therefore you must not be stopping anything. We're stopping this fear, and that's the real issue here. Go ahead.
But since simply threatening someone is often a very effective means of instilling fear in the very same communities, would we criminalize those people for creating fear? Why is the creation
No,
of
we think
fear
this is an
always
entirely
a
much...
standard?
So we think that not only is this a threat, but it is a uniquely credible threat because they've acted on it in the past, right? So like, threatening is one thing, but following through on those threats is another thing. And what you've done when you kill someone and say that like, I killed you because of this, or like, I hate this group of people because of this, and I'm willing to kill for that justification, then you are making a very credible threat, one that we can be sure that indicates that you're going to commit this sort of crime again, and that essentially puts that entire community at risk. All right. So, They gave you this idea about how like beating people doesn't necessarily remove your rights. Like if I'm beating up someone, that doesn't mean my rights to free speech are restricted, and therefore like no standard can be applied here. But I think it's pretty clear that you could just sort of cross-apply the analysis I gave. You're actually making the community worse off because that speech is like uniquely credible as a threat, uniquely damaging to that community. Next, Rich gives you this point about like discourse and increased discourse, but they don't respond to it till the end, so I'm just going to sort of push it around on the flow and instead talk about like our specific standard really quickly. I'll try to make this as clear as possible, I'm sorry. Alright, so our standard is like when damage has been done to the community, when it is clear that there was an intent beyond simple personal vendetta or economic motivations, then we say that's the case. So then again, they're thinking about like racist speech just as bad comes in, but like again, it's not a credible threat, racist speech. It doesn't create the same level of fear. We think this is uniquely bad in this instance. But they also drop our point about this larger motivation for the crime. No thanks, I'll take you on case. As being essential, because Rich says like this crime is not just being committed for these personal reasons, right? And again, like their only response for this comes on their case. I'll get to that when I get that over there. But I think they've really missed this point that it's not just a simple murder. It's not just a simple beating, but it has ulterior motives to that. And that's the real problem. Finally, we get to this issue of discourse, right? And I'm not really sure how they're interpreting this point, because they seem to talk about like racist speech doesn't add to discourse, like hate speech doesn't really add to discourse. But what Rich and I are saying is that any time you ask a community to consider a standard, you ask them to reevaluate this sort of circumstance, right? You ask them to reevaluate like what is acceptable, and furthermore, like you draw attention to the fact that there is this additional marginal harm, right? So when we say, look, the crimes being perpetrated against this community are so great that we have to enact additional legislation because we think there's an additional harm occurring, what it does is draw attention to the fact, no thanks, that these people are being further oppressed, right? And it asks society to act upon this, to remedy this sort of situation, and remove people from it who are bad. All right. The last point they offer here is that like people will be really offended if there's a different standard being held against them. Like the Nazi groups, for example, like will be really angry because we're holding them to a different standard just because of their personal beliefs. All right, so it's going to be really hard to deal with irrational people, but we really think there is this additional marginal crime being added. And like if you could somehow like sit a guy down and explain how like, yeah, look, we're not really trying to hold it against you, buddy, but the fact of the matter is when you kill a Jewish person and scream like anti-Semitic things, you're really not only just harming that guy, but you're harming the rest of his community as well. You're putting like his family in a state of fear, and everyone's like really untrustworthy of you and like is scared for their own survival, like might move to get away from you, and they're not just offended, right? So like, we think that the rational individual would respond to that and not feel persecuted. If they don't, like really there's nothing we can do. We think it outweighs to protect people in the general sense. No thanks. All right, let's move on to the case. So we get the main point here about this like vague standard, right? And I think the purpose for having a new standard sort of emerges when you consider all my analysis about like what the additional harm is, right? But then, like, Rich brings this really good point. Like, you're being targeted not because of a choice you made, right, but because of something that is innate to you. And they give the example of like the slums, and I think, like someone who's grown up in the slums is killed, but they don't actually make a clear link to why like they're killed for being poor. We can make a clear link in hate crimes and like being killed for being Jewish, or like additional aggression perpetrated because you were a Jew, because you were a member of some minority that's hated by people. And while there isn't any sort of additional marginal harm to the person who's a target of that crime, assuming like they die in either case, right, we do think there's that harm to their community. But consider what happens if the person survives, if they're merely beaten, right? So if they know that they were beaten not because like they got some guy into a fight, but because of the way they've acted, that like sort of fear, that etc., extends not only to their community but also to them. So there's an additional harm being done to that person as well. All right. Then they tell you that just like then comes this idea of like when it's okay to persecute an individual based on their past actions. And Rich says, like, no, it's just like spousal abuse, right? And they come up with a pretty clever distinction, actually. And they say, like, past instances of spousal abuse are crimes that are reconsidered. But, like, Rich and I think the spirit of this is still maintained. Because what we say is, like, when you see someone who's committed acts of spousal abuse, you know something about their character. And inside the courtroom, we think it's very relevant, like, to consider someone's character, right? And to consider, like, what kind of person they are. And, like, the jury does this all the time, right? Like, questions relevant to character are permitted in the courtroom. And we think whether or not someone has, like yelled out like racial slurs against people, etc., like should be very valuable in considering that, even if it was within the context of like a beating or something like that. So we don't think this is in any sense double jeopardy. It's just a character evaluation. The next issue here is like whether or not we're going to get inconsistent outcomes, right? Because that's kind of what they're going for with their vague standard. Like, it's a perversion of justice is what they want you to believe. And that there's going to be no way to like read these people's minds and know whether or not there was truly hate. Mr. Speaker, our standard isn't like, did this person have hate? Like, if we had a mind-reading machine, could we like go over his head and see if he had hate in his heart when he committed this crime? But the harm we want to talk about here is like the thing done to the community. Like, that's the proof that there's like an additional hate crime being done. Like, if the community is hurt because of this, then we know that there's a crime. So we're not going to actually catch places where just like people hate Jews and like this crime didn't commit any additional harm. We think really the only things we actually do have to consider are instances when a clear sign has been left. Why? Because if there was no clear sign, there's no additional harm to the community, so it doesn't mean our standard of a hate crime, right? So like we actually do think we get to only consider these special cases, and that's pretty good for us. All right. So then they get into this whole analysis about how like there's no additional crime being done. We already have laws against this, so on and so forth. Like I think we responded to this pretty succinctly. Like we think there is this additional harm, there is this additional crime. The last idea is this issue of precedent, right? And whether or not we're setting a precedent for like targeting minority views with legislation. Mr. Speaker, I think this is really a twist on what the real issue in this round is, right? Because in some sense, we are setting up a standard that says like certain ideas are unpopular. But recognize that we're not saying just the exercise of those ideas is a bad thing. Like we're still okay with racist speech. But we think the exercise of those ideas in specific circumstances, like that bring very large meaning to them, right? That like draw this further issue of like hate and hatred and like sort of like pushing this community off to the side, like deprioritizing this community, right? We think that that's the real issue here. There's this, these minority groups are being doubly hurt by this point, and like we think that's the real harm here. So we do agree that like it kind of sucks to have the majority set a standard that punishes some majority, but we think when the majority set a standard that punishes some minority, like the majority punishes the Nazis. But we think that because the Nazis are then punishing the Jews to like a very large extent, like as illustrated through our case, we think that then in that instance, we're okay with taking away their rights because of the way that they've taken away rights of other people. We think this mitigates their arguments about free speech. On these notes, I'm proud to oppose.
Here, here. I thank the member of opposition. Now we call on the leader of the opposition to deliver the first rebuttal speech, not exceed 4 minutes. Here.
Thanks for recalling me, Mr. Speaker. I think there are 3 important questions to consider today. The first question we want to ask you is there an additional harm committed in what we consider like a hate crime? All right. So first, recognize what we tell you. We tell you that there's an important distinction, and it's that is a group targeted. It's not an individual targeted. Like recognize that we tell you that like Andrew committing a crime specifically against me and saying that he hates me, we don't go ahead and call that a hate crime. We don't subject that to additional punishment because it doesn't have an effect on anyone beyond my own person. But if he says that he wants to kill me because I'm Jewish, recognize what does that do? That commits a crime against the rest of the community. And we think this is a pretty clear distinction, and we don't get a whole lot of analysis from them on this point. But we also tell you what's the important part here and why do we punish it? It's due to fear, and this is an important distinction. This shows you why we're okay with punishing someone for a hate crime in a situation after some sort of other crime has been committed, as opposed to a situation where I might go engage in a speech act down at a protest but not actually do anything violent. The people that I'm harming actually have a reason to believe that I would hurt them as well. If I kill someone, another person of that person's group, if say they're Jewish, might actually think that I'm going to kill them. We say that only some sort of racist or like anti-group speech act in and of itself is not something that like actually harms them unless they have some reason to believe it. We're okay with like things like racist speech because we think that it doesn't have a unique additional harm. Additionally, like they really just concede the standard that we give you is to like the reason why we go on characteristics that you can't control, right? If you say that like to give you a quick example of this, there's a difference between anti-military speech and anti-gender speech, because joining the military is an action that I choose to do, right? And if they want to say that I'm bad for joining the military, that's something that I'm bringing on themselves. But if they tell someone that they have some sort of negative personality characteristic for being a woman, that's something that they can't control, and that's where we have discrimination and other sorts of protections for them. But the second question we want to ask is can we punish people in this situation? And what is this question ultimately boiling down to? What type of standard do we have and how is it applied? So here's what we tell you. We tell you that at the point that you have some level of community harm, that's when there's been an act done. And they kind of laugh at us for this, but don't really respond to the analysis that we give you. We tell you at the point that there's a credible threat, that the community that's left after the crime has been committed, say after one Jewish person has been killed, the other 9 remaining out of that community, for instance, they then have a credible threat and recognize that there's been a crime done against them. And we think that it's a pretty clear distinction, and there's a pretty clear harm that's done, because it affects the way that they live going forward. It makes them live in fear. It makes them alter the decisions they make, and it negatively impacts their ability to function within society. And we think that this is a very bad thing to do to people. But then the next question is it legitimate to use past information when making these decisions under this standard? And Andrew gives you a lot of really good analysis here, right? He tells you that the reason we look to past information, it's a question of character, right? And that's ultimately the distinction they try to make when I give you the example of spousal abuse is that that's an actual crime that's been committed. But it's not just about the crime, right? It's about showing what the person does and how they act. And we think that this is no different in terms of judging for character. Also, the last question that the last part of this area of analysis that they're really concerned about is this idea of double jeopardy. I'm just going to touch it fast here. Recognize that there's no actual punishment meted out for that previous crime, right? It's not we're saying that here's a sentence and there was 2 years for crime that happened in the past that we looked at, because we're not actually making a judgment on that, right? We're only using it to evaluate character, and we think that's pretty clear. The last question we want to ask you today is when do we step on people's rights? We think it's pretty clear in a situation like this. There are differing standards here. Recognize that groups that harm rights against someone, for instance a neo-Nazi group, right? They bring additional scrutiny on themselves because they're held to a different standard for the reason that's pretty simple. They're committing 2 crimes, right? They're either killing or injuring some particular person, but they're also hurting many other people. And ultimately what this boils down to is we all agree that First Amendment rights to free speech are not unlimited. The question is simply where do we draw the line? And Andrew and I tell you that it's pretty simple in this case, because recognize that we have 2 parties that are contrasting here, right? We have the person who's committing the speech act that we say is hate crime, and we have the person that's being punished by this. In this case, it's maybe a particular other person, but the whole community he belongs to. And we think that ultimately you need to err on the side of the huge community, because it has a much bigger impact. At the end of the day, what do we tell you? We're okay with things like racist speech, but we're not okay when it's coupled with a threat. We tell you that the majority always is the one that imposes the rule. We tell you that this rule can be fairly done, and we tell you that ultimately we give you a society where people can live not in fear and can actually go about their day-to-day lives within the community. We're very proud to oppose.
Sure. I thank you, Dr. Now we call the Prime Minister to complete the round of the speech. Here.
Okay, so I actually think things are pretty clear. This first argument is going to be the idea of the standards erected by this side of the House, and I'm going to go through it kind of organically, basically summarizing the round within that first point. Then secondly, as an add-on, I'll give you the idea of prescribability, which will include both vagueness and the idea of speech. But first, this idea of whether or not the standards erected on this side of the House justify this ballot. I don't think they do. First, they tell us that the obvious standard of the idea that hate crimes can't be controlled for is what we really need to look at, right? And we gave you enough ink on this side of the House, good ink, I think, that this point doesn't even exist anymore. And here's what we said. First, we said that we could apply this to all crimes, right? There are many instances in which crime is committed against someone who happens to not be able to control for a situation, right? There's always the accident of fate involved in every crime, right? To which we get the response, well, they weren't sought after, right? Which is why I kind of asked in the very first speech, why is being sought after in the first place necessarily a normative problem in the first place? Serial killers, for instance, seek after a very specific idea about who they're killing, or whom they're killing in the first place. I gave you the word design, but the same idea is the case, right? Whether or not seeking someone is always necessarily a bad thing. We don't really get a good response to the idea that being sought after is always bad. The only response we hear is that sometimes being sought after creates fear. So far what we're getting down here is the idea that creation of fear is the standard, because the first standard that you can't control for something has evolved into the second standard, the creation of fear. We also beat this standard. How did we beat it? We gave you 3 arguments. First, we said that simple words can also cause fear. So legally, judicially, you can't really give any reason to believe that like also simple words can't incite violence, right? I'll respond to this in 1 second, because of the 3 arguments we gave, this is the only one they responded to where they said it's not a credible threat. The second 2 arguments we gave against why this creation of fear isn't a good standard is secondly, because any act against a community, and Lewis tells you this, even for non-racial reasons, non-gendered reasons, is always an act against the community which will scare them, right? Fear is the necessary product of violence in the first place. You don't need to be black and killed to have your death affect your community anyway, right? So there's no reason to believe that this is somehow, politically important or why this law in the books is necessary. Third, we say, and this never gets good response, that the fact of these racial beliefs being emotional, conditioned, or impulsive in the first place means you're not likely to get an end to the violence, so there will always be the credibility that someone will still do it despite the law being on the books. 3 good arguments to believe that fear isn't the best response to this. The only they respond to is this first, that simple words can also create fear. And their response is, well, it's not credible. But I guess, wait, wasn't I just telling you why it was credible with the very last argument I gave you? To which we'll give you 2 more responses in case that wasn't credible enough in terms of argumentation. First, we said that the crimes are self-identical anyway, right? That like if you're really using as a standard the idea that like a crime is credible in terms of forecasting a future crime, then every crime is technically a credible threat because it's once happened, right? This is the idea that credibility is somehow self-perpetuating because it once happened already. There's no reason to believe that any crime is any different in this sense, because crime obviously in and of itself creates the sensation that it's probably going to happen again. The second argument we give you, however, is this idea that it's still credible at the point at which like there is emotional stuff happening, right? At the point at which you can still guarantee action to occur. They don't disagree that these things aren't going to go away, that when Lewis tells you racism will still exist and that this punishment doesn't altogether get rid of it, people aren't going to stop being afraid. So we don't see a good reason why the punishments make sense at that point. But finally, we tell you that this idea of the emotionalism and all of this stuff really creates another problem for them, because the only other standard they give you in the round is the idea of discourse. First, we would argue that all of the emotional ideas and the conditional aspect of all of these beliefs means that you're not going to get discourse because these people won't change their minds anyway. And you can't just like discourse with someone who's like shouting racial slurs through a megaphone. But second of all then, we also told you about the idea of discourse, that you can just as easily get as much discourse by killing someone and putting it on TV. So we've hit the idea of community, the idea of can't control for, and the idea of discourse, all of which are non-unique, could apply to any other situation. I don't think they've met their burden. The final argument then has to be the idea of prescribability, the first component of which is the idea of vagueness. I tell you, there are only like 3 actually really problematic scenarios in which this could possibly enter into the legal system. I'm of the mind that these have always occurred in every one of these cases. The first is that you're either condemned by the past. The second is that you're condemned by the idea of self-declared victim testimony, which is inherently biased by an interested party. And the third is the idea that it's politically perverse. The only thing they tell you is that the legal system will obviously keep trying. We don't disagree that the legal system is there, right? But that keeping trying or continuing on with the idea of the standard doesn't matter at the point at which the only idea of how you could possibly try is constrained by all of these 3 things that I give you. They don't ever tell you why you could ever have more absolute knowledge, but they try to clarify it just once. They say this idea of condemned by the past is silly because you have spousal abuse situations, and that's pretty crucial. But Lewis tells you spousal abuse is very different because this was a crime that you were condemned by. Crimes create precedents for future crimes, but at the point at which you've created a precedent out of politics that were in the past, you see the problem with this legislation, that it's always conditioned by politics. No good response, especially in that last speech. The final argument is speech, right? Why speech is not unlimited. That's what they say. That's their final kind of standard. We don't disagree that speech is not unlimited. All we're asking for is why limited in this case? Why attach an act to speech, and why confound the two? They've never given us a good reason to believe why all of the things they're talking about don't equally apply to non-speech effects, and why in this case speech isn't exactly the reason why they're creating these policies. I think we've convinced you. I think we've taken down their standards, and I think we're very proud to propose. Thanks a lot.